And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Amanda Izzo. Amanda comes to us from the Women and Gender Studies Department at the College of New Jersey, where she's been a visiting assistant professor. And when she leaves us, she will be moving to the University of St. Louis, where she will be assistant professor of Women and Gender Studies. She did her doctoral work at Yale, but I think her the die was cast for a life in women's history before she got to Yale at Smith College, where...
Did you major in American Studies?
Mm-hmm. Glad to hear. And Dan Horowitz is here, who was part of that great education. But she also served as a manuscripts processor at Smith College's Sophia Smith Collection. And all women's historians owe her a debt of gratitude. She processed the papers of Gloria Steinem, of Helen Gurley Brown, and of the YWCA, about which much more very soon. She has given many papers and done lots of interesting things on the way to the project that she's going to talk about today, The Commandment of Love, Liberal Christianity and Global Activism in the Young Women's Christian Association and the Mary Knowles Sisters. The project goes from 1907 to 1980. She'll be talking about one part of that project today. Amanda, it is such a pleasure for me to have a scholar in my own field of American women's history with us here to be able to introduce your lecture. So please, enlighten us.
Thanks, Anne.
Pleasure.
And thank you all for coming. It's so exciting to see your friendly faces. And Tracy, thank you for the church supper we have before us. And all that's missing, I feel like, is the smell of stale fish fry hanging over the air like in the church basement. So my talk today is a piece of my overall book project that I'll be completing with the Women's Studies and Religion program. The book is entitled The Commandment of Love. Here I'll be talking about American women, Christian politics, and the Long Red Scare. I have here in my hands a list of names that have been provided to the Federal Bureau of Investigation of affiliates of the Communist Party who nevertheless still worked and shaped policy in one of the largest women's organizations in U.S. history. These are the FBI files of the YWCA. Here I have just a couple of the CIA documents about the Mary Knowles Sisters. YWCA, an ecumenical women's organization, a volunteer organization. Its roots stretch to the 1850s. Mary Knowles Sisters are a Roman Catholic religious congregation, the first congregation of women religious in the United States to send women into foreign mission. And so I want to look at the perhaps unlikely chapter in the Red Scare, in the history of Red Scares in the United States, in the history of radicalism and religion. But also, my inquiry starts with religious life and American politics in the present day. It's become fairly well established that evangelicalism has become a dominant force in American political life. Mainline Protestantism had a certain cultural hegemony, but they've been supplanted by evangelicals since the Reagan years, who have decisively shaped foreign policy and domestic social legislation. So a swirl of factors produced the ascendancy of evangelical politics. Certainly there are demographic matters, the explosive rise in evangelical congregations, coupled with a steady decline in membership in mainline churches. There are cultural ones. Historians identify the 1960s as a breaking point. On one side, the concerns of church leaders for issues, social issues like civil rights, anti-war issues, they far outpace those of their congregants. And from another angle, in the words of historian David Hollinger, these churches lost many of their children to a post-Protestant secularism, Who said one has to be Christian to do the right thing? The mainline churches yielded much of the symbolic capital of Christianity to their evangelical rivals. So in other words, liberal Protestants ceded the mantle of Christian politics in becoming ecumenical, in downplaying theology in favor of widening the scope of religious reform. My talk today is an attempt to be a corrective or maybe a modification of that way of explaining the rise of evangelical politics and the religious right. Because when I looked into the Mary Knowles Sisters and the YWCA, I found that they did not yield the mantle of Christian politics to evangelicals. It wasn't ceded, it was seized. And so I make reference to a long Red Scare to explain this. Why long Red Scare? The Red Scare is these concerted, often extra-legal measures of suppressing leftist thought in the United States. They're typically discussed as occurring in two waves, both following the world wars. And that periodization captures the intensity and reach of anti-radical efforts at particular moments in time. But it doesn't capture the persistence, the targeted attacks that in their repetition made the social ideals of mainline churches illegible and illegitimate in American public life. And so I don't really have the opportunity to give the long view of this long Red Scare, but I hope that by looking at a couple of incidents, I can give a sense of the scope, the persistence, and the toll of these attacks. My look into the long Red Scare is premised on the instrumentality of women in religion and political life. And so the corrective here too is that while Red Scares are typically discussed in terms of labor unions, cultural producers, political organizations, I think it's important to highlight that campaigns to suppress radicalism were very much part of 20th century women's movements on both sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum. So there's important intersections in the institutional structures and theological commitments of Mary Knowles and the YWCA, but I'll discuss them separately and chronologically, starting with attacks on the YWCA that occur between the 1930s and the 1950s. So a little bit about the history of the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association of the USA. It's one of the most important and far-ranging organizations in U.S. women's history. It has its origins in mid-19th century evangelical groups that dedicated themselves to collective prayer and social services for women alone in the city. And that picture in the corner there gives you a little sense of where they were coming from. That's 19th century publicity, that picture of that woman wandering the hostile streets of the city. It was inspired by, but always independent from, the Young Men's Christian Association, and it became very famous for the tangible social services that it provided, things like housing, job training, and recreation. By the 1920s, it was the third largest women's organization in the U.S. There are hundreds of local associations in every sort of community, and its reach was international. The overall conceit of association was to bridge social divisions among women, and it was successful in doing so in that it had a considerable contingent of working class women who participated in the programs. It was interracial, though that of course does not mean that segregation, racism didn't exist. And there was an extensive array of programming directed at immigrant families in the United States and directed outward at building transnational connections. So the first point in the red baiting of the YWCA starts around 1920, when its special focus on working women is no longer expressed simply through this desire for the spiritual uplift of potentially wayward souls. In 1920, the organization endorsed legislation that would give workers the right to organize into unions. And that was a very controversial step for any sort of mainstream organization in 1920, let alone a women's religious organization. At that point, the attacks really seemed to be part of the fringe. The YWCA had a cloak of respectability. It had a very favorable public profile, and so it was able to shake off this type of attack. The first rumblings of what would really ensnare the YWCA in the McCarthy era of anti-radical campaigns came with the creation of the Congressional Committee charged with monitoring subversion in the U.S. government, the Dees Committee, which was the predecessor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. An informant named Kenneth Goff identified YWCA Secretary Rose Turlin as member of the Communist Party, said that she had attended communist meetings. And she was the staff advisor to student groups. She also produced a lot of writings about Christian social action. She'd been trained as an economist and was a big supporter of Christian-inflected New Deal era economic planning. It was pretty easy for her to defend herself against Goff's attacks because she had documentation that she was out of the country on the days that he said she was at Communist Party meetings. So she was cleared before the committee, and that was the end of the investigation. So this is 1939. The burst of anti-radicalism fades away amidst mobilization for the World War. But it comes back with a vengeance in 1946. And the simple fact of having been named once provides this endless grist for what is no longer a fringe preoccupation. Just that one incident becomes enough for this to snowball into a much larger campaign. The exoneration really doesn't matter. The testimony would become referenced again and again by anti-communist critics as proof that YWCA women rendered yeoman service to the Communist Party and its front organizations, as Congressional Representative George Dondero charged in 1946. In their vehemence, these Perrys would put the YWCA in a vulnerable position, and they began to have an impact on its reputation and accordingly the fundraising. So in 1948, we get some sustained attention to the nexus between Christian practice and subversive social action as Joseph Camp devotes an entire tract to uncovering YWCA subversion. So you see in behind the lace curtains of the YWCA this lacy overlay on the YWCA insignia, suggesting that this respectable space is hiding communism. And then, of course, the sickle and hammer replacing the C in the name. And so Camp promised to reveal a comprehensive array of infiltration, and so you see a denunciation of its interracialism, of its labor politics, but he really goes in on what he calls its revolution or religion with a revolutionary flavor. The YWCA's religious identity, he writes, was a deliberate subterfuge that injected anti-capitalist, anti-Christian, and anti-American propaganda into religious activity. So it's a paradox. You have the YWCA's Christianity being anti-Christian. YWCA leaders certainly thought of the organization as Christian, even as they eliminated programming like Bible study and devotions, which its religious director wrote in the late 1920s. She said that these no longer gave the association its dynamic for living. So they held to a politicized social gospel, even as the social gospel lost its traction in theological circles, when Reinhold Niebuhr assailed this optimistic confidence in the ability of love to transform the social order. YWCA women continued to hold out the possibilities for love as a transformative force, and they continued to locate the practice of Christian faith in ethical personal development and social consciousness. One of the big thrusts of their programming was promoting boundary-crossing fellowship as the starting point for the Christianization of society. It was the realization of the social ethics promoted by Jesus in the gospel. So that's where you get that pioneering interracial work. where black and white students come together in summer camps and study groups with the idea that these one-on-one encounters would start an interconnected chain of relationships that go from the individual to the community and then outward into the world. An early public affairs publication said something of this in saying, women must see in citizenship an opportunity to set into motion an ever-widening circle of friendship, which shall reach from the woman in a small Ohio village to an isolated group in India. So the answer to strife and structural injustice started with learning to love one's neighbor, and then it was put into practice on the structural level by using the tools of representative democracy. So the YWCA comes up with this idea of Christian citizenship, that this is the modern method of religious practice. For Joseph Camp and his ilk, of course, this is a subterfuge. And the declining emphasis on the relationship of the individual to the divine, their modernistic approach to worship, and their voter education materials meant to him that red revolutionists and confirmed atheists found ready acceptance in YWCA circles. So in this regard, with the religious programming, YWCA women are calculating, they're duplicitous, they're using the veneer of religion to draw people into communism. And he finds a lot of problems in their public affairs material, the poisonous paragraphs on public affairs, that he summarized the content as, hurrah for Russia, down with the USA. So YWCA endorsements included the New Deal expansion of the social welfare state, efforts for world governance, these very optimistic visions of harnessing the power of the state to create a mutually cooperative society. But of course, after the war, those types of endorsements were highly suspect, and anti-communists gathered power at both the grassroots and the highest level of government. So Camp occupies a place truly on the fringe. He was among the realm of professional anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. And I want you to note the uncle of John Voight, okay, who continued some of his politics. These are some other individuals involved in the early red baiting of the YWCA. There's Elizabeth Dilling, who wrote several pamphlets denouncing the Ys. That's her at her sedition trial. And then Kenneth Goff, that informant who named Rose Turlin, was a protege of Christian Identity founder Gerald L.K. Smith. So it goes from being the province of people like this to being a preoccupation at the highest level of government. And so the House Un-American Activities Committee itself highlights the Christian communist connection in a federally distributed pamphlet, and it singles out the YM and YWCA. So is every YWCA a communist hideout, it asks. No, but they've dug into such groups and are at it today. And so this is kind of a typical characteristic of anti-communist attacks on women. They're dupes, they're being taken advantage of. But at the same time, it places a scrutiny, HUAC places a scrutiny on the social Christianity, the underpinnings, the theological underpinnings of its programming. And the pamphlet charged that communist policies were disguised as welfare work for minorities or oppressed groups. And that capacious construction of what constitutes the Communist Party line made any sort of call for political or social change evidence of infiltration. And the YWCA had long put forward a public affairs program that sought to ameliorate the conditions of oppressed groups. So I think that this right here is an especially important moment for recognizing that the considerable tradition of the social gospel doesn't fade away from the American consciousness. It's pushed out. The face of liberal Protestantism, Reinhold Niebuhr, insulated himself from that type of attack by adding moral gravitas to aggressive anti-communism. The next anti-communist assault on the YWCA is significant, I think, from two angles. First, it's a reminder of the spectrum of women's movements, that the 20th century women's movements don't simply come out of the left or liberal contexts. And second, this very local episode of red baiting portended a massive transformation in the centers of power in American political life, a transformation that's certainly bearing fruit right now. It shows us something of the grassroots method of discrediting the spiritual underpinnings of liberal Protestantism. So not only do we get those charges coming from the fringe, which get official sanction through entities like the House Un-American Activities Committee, but we have these very effective ground-level campaigns that compel the YWCA to retreat from its advocacy. So in November of 1951, YWCA fundraising executive Dorothy Nauset traveled to Alton, Illinois, to smooth controversy created by a board member in the local association, a volunteer who sat on the finance committee. I do not believe I've ever spent a harder 2 days than those in Alton, she wrote in a confidential dispatch to the president of the National YWCA. The trouble? Mrs. J.F. Schlafly Jr., finance chairman, young, in her late 20s, attacked the YWCA because we were pink. We had communists on our staff, and Alton didn't want to send money when it was spent that way. So the source of the hard time was then a full-time housewife, a woman who 6 years previously had earned an MA in government from Radcliffe, and she was the future sweetheart of the silent majority, Phyllis Schlafly. Nauset took some pot shots at Schlafly in the memo, called her pleasant but cold and brittle, insinuated she was a social climber. She noted more than once that Schlafly was Catholic, and it doesn't say exactly why she keeps noting that, but it evokes the long-standing distrust of Catholics, perhaps questioning whether Schlafly was an agent provocateur with shadowy loyalties. And board members seem to have shared some of that concern. Nauset talked to them privately, and the president of the association Nauset asked the president of the association whether Schlafly should really be on the finance committee, and the president said that it was better to have her on the inside where her movements could be known. So Phyllis Schlafly demanded the YWCA institute a loyalty oath for its employees, placing in their contracts a pledge that read that they supported private property and an economy free from government control and ownership. Nauset reported that Schlafly was a convincing speaker and that local board members had no problem approving that oath. Nauset talked to a couple of the employees, one who said that she would not sign that oath, so Nauset put forward a compromise oath that was, it satisfied that employee, but it was still very patriotic and adamantly capitalist, and the compromise oath, a firm belief in the American philosophy of individual opportunity, private property, and free enterprise. Schlafly was temporarily placated. She had an unsuccessful congressional campaign in 1952, and then she goes on the attack again in 1953, distributing around in Alton a paper that asks, "What's happened to the C in YWCA?" And I think it's important to note that Schlafly didn't cut her teeth on anti-feminism. And I don't think that her real passion is for women's issues as such. It's really about anti-statism and the rejection of social legislation, which is what she goes after in this paper. She distributed this to the community chest, the local community chests, which funded organizations like the YWCA. She singled out the considerable public affairs content in the YWCA magazine, stating that she could not understand why the YWCA was always advocating more than other agencies. And I can see why she asked that question. There was tension between the types of programming that local associations conducted, the types of things people were interested in at the ground level, and the commitments of the national staff. Who put out a lot of publications, who engaged in direct lobbying, and clearly advocated for liberal causes. Schlafly's attacks on the YWCA magazine were not unusual in that time for their stride in anti-communism. She was especially appalled that the student groups had called for recognition of Red China. The central issue, though, the thing that had taken the C out of the YWCA was, she wrote, "For every problem, social and economic, national YWCA professionals have but one solution: more government control and more government spending." It was persistent indoctrination for socialism. So she's arguing that that promotion of Christian citizenship, this designed to make love a guiding force in political and economic life, contradicted the true teaching of Jesus. In Schlafly's schema, Jesus values the individual over the collective. And Schlafly wrote that the organization's political endorsements purport to show that Jesus favored government-guaranteed cradle-to-the-grave security. The Good Samaritan can pass by his wounded neighbor with impunity. A government bureaucrat will do the job for him. So state-sponsored social services, in her esteem, weakened rather than reflected the spirit of fellowship. And so unsurprisingly, Schlafly drifted away from the YWCA after she served her term as finance chair, and she moved on to the Daughters of the American Revolution, a volunteer commitment that was more amenable to her political passions. So actions like these, repeated in several contexts, there were one in Queens that made the national news. There was a couple of these that made national news. They put the YWCA on the defensive. Rose Turlin transitioned into YWCA work that took her out of the public eye. And overall, the organization muted the political content of its programming. It didn't repudiate it, it didn't abandon it, but no longer do you see these types of articles in the magazine calling for consideration of whether the United States should recognize Red China. It was an organization that was already struggling financially, and it was pragmatic for it to shy away from controversy and avoid ruffling the feathers of its funders. The next stage in the YWCA's religious life was a triumphant and stirring one. It contributed crucial groundwork and leadership to the church-based civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. But religion after that became much more attenuated than it had ever been. And because of those transformations within mainline Protestantism that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the C becomes a smaller and smaller part of the YWCA. But in fact, it was only a couple of years ago that they elected to completely eliminate discussion of Christianity and its institutional mission. The organization hasn't died, it decentralized, it's shifted its focus, and it determined that its a formal identification with Christianity didn't further its institutional mission. And these more contemporary materials, I think, give you a sense of the institutional mission of the YWCAs that remain. So, turn attention now to the Maryknoll sisters, with an eye here to giving a sense of the scope of anti-radical attacks. This isn't just a mainline Protestant thing, and it's not something limited to the McCarthy era. I'll focus in on the international outrage over the deaths of Maryknoll sisters in El Salvador, and how subsequently conservative forces in the White House and the church influenced the neutralization of the social justice wing of the Catholic Church that had emerged in the 1970s. The Maryknoll Sisters of St. Dominic are recognized by many as a force in Christian activism today. That's a fairly recent public identity. They initiated their work under the spirit of submissiveness expected of women religious in the pre-conciliar church. It began in the 19-teens as the first American women's religious order dedicated to foreign mission, and it just seemed monumental to people in the church that women were out in the field engaging in pastoral work, running educational and health facilities on their own. And so they were adapting the innovations of the Protestant women's foreign mission movement, this idea of woman's work for woman, to the Catholic Church, and they established an identity as innovators, people who could reach populations that the clergy could not reach. And so they established successful clinics and schools and gained recognition within the church for their professional skills as well as their sacred vows. So that's how they got some autonomy in their community life. The ecclesiastical hierarchy commissioned sisters' labor in the U.S. and around the world as healthcare workers, as teachers, support staff. Before the Second World War, Maryknoll focused its attention on East Asia, as well as immigrant communities, Asian immigrant communities within the United States. After the Second World War, Maryknoll grew in territory and ambitions, and it began to articulate a really politicized sense of mission when the Vatican and the American Church promoted liberal anti-communist internationalism as the future of Catholicism. So Maryknoll is situated in all of these mission territories with its charitable interventions aligning perfectly with the Cold War battle for spheres of influence. Some of the supporters noted that sisters, with their altruistic concern for people in struggling nations, were opening doors for U.S. Development. They served, in the assessment of one State Department official, albeit unwittingly, as their country's best goodwill ambassadors. So seeing developing nations as pawns, potential pawns in the Soviet quest for world domination, Maryknoll women promoted economic self-sufficiency through things like credit unions and microloans, designed their educational endeavors to fight the blandishments of communism. And as they became cold warriors, armed with a sense of righteousness, of Christian righteousness, and of American goodwill. Turning away from that legacy of submissiveness and that expectation that their service would be hidden, very publicly embracing the idea that they were on the front lines of the Cold War. So you see a Time magazine story, Bernie Becomes a Nun was a book that promoted Catholic vocations using Maryknoll's sisters. It was serialized in Cosmopolitan magazine. Maryknoll embraced, not that Cosmopolitan magazine. Oh, no. But Maryknoll embraced the changes in theology and community structures ushered in by the Second Vatican Council just as enthusiastically as they endorsed anti-communist internationalism. They responded to the call for the renewal of religious orders from the perspective of missionaries who were situated amidst staggering poverty and global unrest. They had long had an affinity for direct ministry to the poor. That was one of their callings, and emphasized community-level empowerment. So this, by the end of the 1960s, situated them at the forefront of the liberation theology movement in Catholicism. And many in its ranks grew invested in leftist theology, concluding that revolutionary social movements could give expression to a gospel vision of Jesus as the liberator of the poor. A 1970 booklet announced, "We wish to manifest our concern for and affirm our solidarity with all those who are struggling for justice and peace. We shall work in cooperation with all groups who share this concern." Their participation in the grassroots work of liberation theology prompted the congregation leadership to begin engaging in public advocacy around the U.S. funding of repressive regimes around the world. So that with these public critiques of foreign policy, economic policy, Maryknoll gets a reputation as an activist, even radical congregation. The first rumblings of the red baiting of Maryknoll as an entity would come with the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1978, in which liberation theology-influenced orders became a highly influential contingent of the Sandinista insurgency. And this gave occasion for Michael Novak and his compatriots on the Catholic right to launch a campaign against Maryknoll, an order where he said the Marxists are plainly riding high. 2 years later, 1980, Maryknoll's presence in conflict regions becomes international news when the congregation found itself at the center of one of the most galvanizing events of 20th century American Catholic life. Two of its sisters, alongside two other Catholic women missionaries, were murdered in early December of that year by National Guardsmen in El Salvador. This story is familiar to a lot of people. Maura Clark and Ita Ford, the Maryknoll sisters, embarked on their final assignment to El Salvador in response to Archbishop Oscar Romero's request for mission personnel, in a country where the Catholic Church was relentlessly and violently hounded for its role in organizing the poor. In fact, Romero himself was assassinated weeks before Clark and Ford arrived in March of 1980. The sisters set out to provide emergency services to impoverished refugees in a province terrorized by secret police. In December, the two sisters flew into the San Salvador airport after attending a meeting in Nicaragua. They left the airport with two of their colleagues, an Ursuline sister named Dorothy Kazel and a lay missionary named Jean Donovan. The next day, the women's van was found burned by the side of the road, and their bodies were disinterred from a shallow grave. They had been tortured and shot at close range. The deaths put the atrocities occurring in El Salvador on the front pages of news around the world, and the visibility of the event puts Maryknoll into a new stage of the Cold War. So at the mid-century, you have the sisters as a worldwide spiritual army, promoting American goodwill, winning souls away from atheistic communism. This time, the deaths seemed an indelible indictment of U.S. foreign policy, where under the excuse of fighting communism, the United States was providing enormous military and financial support to regimes that were quite obviously brutally repressive. But conservatives wasted no time in pushing back against that indictment, casting the sisters as communists and identifying the deaths as the consequence of radical allegiances. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was President-elect Ronald Reagan's designated ambassador to the United Nations, denounced the sisters in a story published a couple of weeks after their deaths. Most observers recognize that the executions were the work of El Salvador's military, but not Kirkpatrick. She said, "I don't think the government of El Salvador was responsible. The nuns were not just nuns. The nuns were political activists working on behalf of the insurgents, and somebody who was using violence to oppose the insurgents killed them." So she was following the line of the Salvadorian government that a fringe group was responsible. This was part of an internecine war among rebels, and the implication was that the sisters had been asking for it by getting involved. Kirkpatrick had reason to defend the Salvadorian government's account, despite the evidence to the contrary that quickly came to light, because she'd already announced an affinity for what she called moderately oppressive regimes that were friendly to the United States over socialist ones. And Jimmy Carter had had a tentative commitment to human rights, expressed in this instance that he suspended military aid after this happened. But Reagan's soon-to-be appointees had no compunction in announcing that human rights would have no part in foreign policy under Ronald Reagan. So Kirkpatrick here is laying groundwork for what would be called the Reagan Doctrine, this generous, often clandestine financial support of anti-communist governments and opposition movements. Few opted for the callousness of maligning the sisters days after their deaths, but a number of critics joined the fray as Reagan immediately rolled back the détente of the 1970s. And Jimmy Carter restored the aid to El Salvador on his last day in office. So there was a month when El Salvador didn't have military aid. Secretary of State Alexander Haig matched Kirkpatrick's maliciousness and groundlessly suggesting there may have been an exchange of gunfire. And so at this press conference, he was pressed on that insinuation that the women fired weapons. He backpedaled and he laughed and he said, "I haven't met any pistol-packing nuns in my day." And so a New York Times writer expressed the revulsion that a lot of people felt watching this play out. Haig, talking about the vicious killing, suggested they were responsible in some measure for their fate, When challenged, he tried to slither away, joking and expressing amazement and blaming the press. The conservative media bolstered Haig's effort to drown out the outrage over El Salvador, while Maryknoll's leadership pressed the federal government to drop military aid. The sisters spent the immediate months after the deaths conveying an interpretation of why the women died, explaining how commitments to liberation theology had resulted in this atrocity. The president of the group pledged to announce the good news of the kingdom and to denounce that which diminishes the freedom, the equality, and dignity of people. So she paraphrases Matthew, saying, "Wherever we're called to work, we will make our love active by feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and burying the dead." And she explained that the women had died for their allegiance to those biblical commands. Our sisters were killed because they lived as the gospel of Jesus directed them to live. And she too tied this immediate event to the larger issue at stake, pointing out that the congregation's loss should not overshadow the murders of nearly 9,000 less known people in that country. And then requesting too that Americans urge President Reagan to not permit our government to send any military aid to be used by security forces, which would only serve to further the violence against their own people. The government's response was largely dismissive. Like one or two senators showed up to the hearing where the president explained the presence of Maryknoll's sisters in El Salvador. But a groundswell of outrage placed the sisters in a powerful symbolic place in foreign policy clashes in the 1980s. Catholics in the United States turned out for a variety of protest activities, which a Washington Post reporter called unmatched by few, if any, reactions to past issues, including the controversy over abortion. From the banner that hung outside of the San Francisco Cathedral that read "U.S. dollars, kill U.S. nuns," to countless memorial masses, Catholics at the grassroots spoke out. The bumper sticker "El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam" made its appearance. Feminists, anti-nuclear activists, anti-war protesters organized major actions. So these deaths provided a unifying symbol for a coalition. Catholic participation at the grassroots was considerable, but Catholics were also Maryknoll's most damning critics. Conservative intellectuals invoked the sisters' deaths as symbols of what was wrong with the turn towards social justice that had followed the Second Vatican Council. An editorial in the National Review painted a simple portrait of this Marxist folly, coming to a vitriolic conclusion. The Maryknoll leadership espouses Christian Marxism in its grossest form, inoculates its rank and file with these delusions, then sets them up like ducks in Central American shooting galleries. It does not lessen our abhorrence of the sisters' assassins to describe the order's conduct as despicable. So Phil Donahue's television show, Anti-War Marches, proved accommodating forums for the sisters' view on military aid. The forces mobilizing against liberation theology had Jerry Falwell Live and the American Enterprise Institute. They also had the White House and the Vatican. And John Paul II began his papacy with a cautiously worded critique of liberation theology. He then named Joseph Ratzinger prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican office that historically had been known as the Congregation of the Inquisition. Ratzinger set out to demonstrate that with the phenomenon of liberation theology, we are clearly facing a fundamental danger for the faith of the church with its Marxist underpinnings. So as Reagan thwarted the advance of leftist liberation movements, Ratzinger purged and marginalized liberation supporters, effectively stamping out the influence of liberation theology within the institutional church. Marx didn't invent the poor. He merely described them, a Maryknoll sister told a New York Times reporter in 1985. Just because you care for the poor doesn't make you a communist. But it didn't matter how much the sisters described their vision of Christianity as a commitment to gospel ethics. Their work, the simple charge of Marxism, had the power to render any dimension of their ministry invisible. And as liberation theology was purged, of course, the U.S. church hierarchy was able to focus its political energies completely around sexual politics, narrowing the view of social justice efforts to fights against contraception, homosexuality, and of course, abortion. In the present day, women in religious orders in the U.S. have had to face the outright censure of an ecclesiastical hierarchy in their resistance to these priorities. As you may have heard, the Vatican undertook a procedural inquiry of women religious that suggested disciplinary action against liberal activist congregations. In addition, the Maryknoll Sisters, like all women's congregations in the U.S., is an aging population, and end-of-life care is as much on the agenda as foreign mission. Nevertheless, Maryknoll has not muted its advocacy, and its members remain dedicated to the pastoral field even as they enter their 70s and 80s. New areas of interest like environmentalism and HIV ministry have been incorporated into the long-standing fields of education, health, and advocacy for social justice. So to conclude, the story of the long Red Scare might be a depressing one to liberal Christians. Hewing to religious beliefs made some of these women enemies of the state. But there's a lot of inspirational moments when I conducted this research, and getting to know women who were involved in the YWCA and the Maryknoll Sisters, I took heart from the way in which they continued to draw from their own powerful organizational heritages of activism, the heritage of women's social justice work, and of the power of the inspiration of liberal religious thought to make a better world. And so whether their voices come through loudly or, as is now the case, more softly in our current political clamor, these women continue to carry forward a tradition that reshaped the role and capacity of women inside and outside of the churches in 20th century America. Thank you.
Amanda, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's really, really refreshing. And I was thinking, what is the vision of the sister about the new generation of women? And how many young women are getting involved in the movement now? And how strong is the legacy? How do you think this sister are communicating this legacy to the new generation of women? The sister. The new sister.
Well, when I was conducting my research a couple of years ago, I got to witness them taking their crop of sisters taking their final vows, and it was a group of 3. And that's pretty typical, 3 a year. And none of the women were from the United States. So I think that the sisters are not trying to, the anomaly is that religious vocations were so populous at the mid-century, and now they've trickled down to these small numbers. And I don't think they have the expectation that they're ever going to regain that type of population in their ranks. But in terms of their legacy, I think that they're very optimistic that the Maryknoll spirit will continue in those one-to-one encounters, that even, the 3 sisters a year, that this still allows them to carry on the spirit of their founders. So that I don't know, sisters strike me as a very optimistic group of people in general, women religious, that they seem quite happy with the state of the congregation and with the quality of the women who enter it. That they're very dedicated to the ideals of the founder.
Maybe, can we pause here while you're walking by, and then we'll give Susanna the next one. Give the microphone to.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks so much. It's a really great paper. I'm trying to get my mind around a kind of virtual history question, that if the long Red Scare had not existed, if the Soviet Union somehow was out of the equation and the Cold War was out of the equation, How do you think this would have played out among these groups? Do you think there would still have been the same a degree of, a kind of liberal, conservative, left and right, pro-state, anti-state, whole range of things? In other words, what kind of energy does the Red Scare supply? I mean, is that the thing that really fuels the heat and animosity, or do you think that, absent that, these things were there anyway? And I guess a sort of follow-up question from that is that in these organizations, do conservative theological and conservative political positions always line up? Or are there people, evangelicals within the YWCA, who are supporting liberal causes or even left-wing causes? And similarly within the Mary Noel Sisters, is there always a lineup between conservative Catholic doctrine and dogma and conservative political ideas?
Well, let's see, start with I think that evangelicals abandoned the YWCA quite early in its history, and this was happening as that split, the modernist fundamentalist split was happening, that the YWCA was no longer an organization that was doing the things they wanted to do, that the YWCA was really expanding in the direction of social Christianity. And so I don't think that the theology of the YWCA, women who were involved with the YWCA for religious reasons, I don't think that evangelicals were a big factor after, say, 1920 or so. Mary Noel, I do think that that alignment is not as precise. I think that there are women, I know that there are women that were not happy with the turn towards public advocacy, and that the changes in the congregation troubled them, but that, that really what happened in the 1970s, the early 1980s, that they stuck with the congregation, and that there's the intensity, the visibility of Mary Noel as a force for kind of left-wing theology has faded away. And so I think that those were difficult years for them, but that it's settled some. So as for if the energy of the Red Scare wasn't there, I think that would have been, that the fate of the YWCA would have been very different. I'm not so sure about Mary Noel, but I think that the perils of the Red Scare and the dangers it posed to the YWCA's financial standing forced a leadership contingent into retreat that they would have rather not, a move they would have rather not taken. And the concerns of the national staff had not necessarily reflected the commitments of the large membership, but they saw the apparatus of the national organization as a way of publicizing these issues, that they didn't have that at their disposal after these Red Scare attacks. And so it meant that a piece of programming that had been crucial to the YWCA in the first half of the 20th century, its program for political advocacy and its voter education efforts, was no longer there. And so I think that really changed the nature of the organization.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a fascinating talk, and I also thought it was a model of how to look at groups like this, other kinds of groups as well. So I appreciate the way you presented it. And I just wanted to ask you something that's not part of this in a sense, but just in terms of a larger framework, I'm just wondering if you were advising someone who was teaching a class on American religion, how would you want them to perhaps alter the nature of the narrative based on this? And I guess in that connection also with women's history, I suppose my frustration or my sadness comes from the sense of constant, marvelous efforts by extraordinary women who were then somehow defeated or at least marginalized. And that pattern recurs so often, and I try so hard to break out of it. And I look for ways of not presenting a lachrymose women's history. And so I wonder if you could think of a way of presenting this that wouldn't be lachrymose in a sense. But I mean, I see the vitality and the vibrancy and the brilliance of it, definitely.
No, that's
but do
really-
you see this as a story of an effort that was defeated or transformed in some way, perhaps, could you say? How would you present it?
I don't know. Those are great. I mean, those are things I grapple with too. And I don't want to tell this as a story of defeat. I mean, one way to tell it is the glorious rise of evangelical women, right? So I don't know. I'm actually curious how you would contend with that. I mean, well, you know, one thing is that liberal Christianity hasn't died, you know, and maybe the rise of evangelicals, there is more diversity than maybe than the popular imagination would have you believe. And so there, I mean, certainly are, like, you could bring in nuns on the bus. And Sister Simone Campbell mobilized around the last couple of elections, a group of sisters going from state to state promoting Obamacare and immigration reform, things like that, so that that type of Christian politics doesn't get much play, but it's still there. It's there to be found, and it's, you know, not as visible as, say, the YWCA was in 1920, but it doesn't mean it isn't still an effective pressure group in some ways. So I think that those, there are examples like that to be found. And I guess it's a matter of reframing the story. I mean, if you, yeah, I'm sorry.
I guess what would worry me is, let's say, imagine me as a very right-wing person, very anti-communist. I could come up and say, in some sense, I could imagine what would anti-communist McCarthyite people want as their enemy? What would be a more perfect enemy than this? They're women, they're nuns, they have their own trouble within the church to begin with, et cetera, et cetera. What a perfect enemy. And so in some way, I wouldn't want to say this ever, but one could say, some awful person could say, they fed right into a McCarthyite era, played right into their hands by what they did, how they did it, et cetera, et cetera. They were just the right enemy to bolster a McCarthyite approach. Do you see what I mean? That's what, I don't want to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't quite know how to, I'm sorry, I can't.
Let's see. Let's pass it back there and then over to Dan and Susan.
I mean, if you're talking about the Maryknolls, though, I'm a little confused whether we're talking about the Maryknolls or we're talking about the Young Women's Christian Association, because I think they are somewhat distinct. I think the Maryknolls were very much influenced, very much inspired by liberation theology and similar types of theology that existed like in Italy. And I don't think that development of that theology, I think, grew very much out of class inequality. I don't think it's ideologically directly reflecting the Cold War. I think it would have developed without the Cold War. I know, speaking with some Maryknoll nuns, so maybe in the early 80s, they told me, well, I think if I were young now, I think if I were a teenager and choosing a profession, I think now I would become a social worker. But at that time, for a young Catholic woman, working class very often, this was really what you did if you wanted to help people. You went into, became a nun. So I just want to offer that as a thought.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, if I could chime in that.
Yeah, if you just pass the microphone down this way.
I think that, you know, liberation theology, as it's often told, seems to come out of nowhere, and it's like all of a sudden we have activist nuns. But I'm trying to, in my work, kind of connect it to their earlier mission, and their small group, the emphasis on kind of small group education is something that went way back, and it turns into base ecclesial communities and kind of in conscientization that this stuff had been part of Maryknoll's practice, and then this gave it a new framework.
Amanda, Dan Horowitz. As you know, I am not now and never have been a card-carrying women's historian. I think you can answer some of the other questions this way, or I want you to think about it, which is that the women in the Y, the Protestant women in the Y, gave in more easily or were less resistant. And it seems to me in what you're saying, the Maryknoll women, and I wonder if you can explain why, were more resistant, more consistent, didn't hide as much in the 50s, and there's much more continuity in their politics. So if that's so, I wonder if you can explain why. Is it a Catholic Protestant? Is it
community
religious?
structures?
Yes, yeah,
I mean, would it be community structures? Because, I mean, the YWCA was a voluntary organization that had to depend on outsiders to keep it going. So with the Maryknoll sisters, I mean, they're an independent congregation, so they're not beholden to a bishop. They don't have to answer to that. They have their own structures of governance. So they didn't, what could you take from them? I guess, they did lose, they got a lot of criticism, a lot of flack. They did lose fundraising, but it doesn't stop them from being a religious institute.
Well, just speaking of nuns in general, as we know in the 60s and beyond, they not only got fewer and fewer new enrollees, but they also had people leaving in massive droves, and a lot of this had to do with the women's movement. And if I could, for a minute, pretend that Mary Daly was here, I think she might say, this is really good that there aren't any more Maryknolls, because it's still a patriarchal religion with a male head, and you can do these good works any way you choose without God or Christ. So that would be another way of saying this is good that they're gone, even though they themselves are good, but as an order and as a structure in society.
Well, and if I could point to one of my, I don't know, Maryknoll sisters are great, but like there was a great book in 1984, created quite a splash in Catholic circles, Lesbian Nuns, and it was edited by two ex-Maryknoll women, that they're out in the forefront in so many ways, so.
I wanted to follow up on that and ask you to think or share with us a little more your thoughts on the implications and interconnections between the story you've told and the way we usually think about and teach the revival of second wave feminism. Because I think there are implications and interconnections there, and I'd be curious about how you see them and how they might factor into the study that you're doing.
Well, it's kind of easy to talk about it in terms of Maryknoll because they were grappling with it at this time of Exodus. And it was one of the things that became a factor in, so the Vatican Council goes from 62 to 65. One of the things that comes out of it is that orders need to revisit their charism, their inspiration, and make a new plan about what is the foundation of their community. And so Maryknoll goes into its re-examination here, as missionaries and as women being affected by the women's movement. And so this plays into their debates over the habit, over community life, and about relationships with men. And there's some high-profile episodes of Maryknoll sisters marrying Maryknoll fathers. They had to add to their constitution that you would be expelled from the order if you got married, even in a civil marriage. Like, this is the point at which they needed to point that out. So I think that they directly grappled with it, and they tried to adapt to it. They, they eliminated the habit. They changed community structures so that women could, get their education on their own, live on their own, things like that. But that it didn't, that women kept leaving nevertheless. So that they tried to incorporate some of the insights of the women's movement, but it wasn't effective in keeping women in religious life. Maryknoll sisters continue to, I'd say it's got a strong component of feminism in its religious output, that I think they were receptive to feminism in the 1970s, and so that they've tried to build their community life based on a lot of that. The YWCA, I don't know, the institutional identity of the YWCA after the 1960s becomes pretty fragmented. But if you look at what YWCAs are doing today, I mean, you're talking about places that are generally child care providers, domestic violence shelters, Head Start providers, things like that. It seems to me that there's a very crucial relationship to feminism in the way that the YWCA has sustained itself. So I'm not sure what the precise links are, but I'm sure it's there.
Hi, Betsy Moore. I was wondering, you characterized the change in the YWCA's activities as one of declining political activism. At the same time, they were becoming more involved in civil rights activism. And I was wondering if that's actually a decline in political activism or more just a change in what its political activism was focusing on.
Definitely, that's definitely fair to say. That maybe decline is the wrong word, but it changes the scope and really focuses in on the civil rights movement, throws a lot of energy there, and so that becomes kind of its political program.
And was that less controversial than what its political activities were before?
I believe so. I mean, the head of the association, a couple of the different women that were heads of the association were very prominent leaders in the civil rights movement, particularly Dorothy Height. And and also the YWCA had been working on being an interracial organization, had been very, kind of putting that front and center since the 1920s. So it was not something within the YWCA that was a question anymore, although they had to expel Montgomery, a couple of different associations in 1964 that still hadn't desegregated after all those years. They had to expel them because of the Civil Rights Act. So I don't think it caused controversy within the association. I think that it had been decided that that was an institutional priority.
I wonder if I can follow up on Susan's question about how this relates to narratives of second wave feminism, and just maybe a couple of possible avenues into that question. One is about the notion of political agency not being seized, or not being ceded, but being seized from another component of the political spectrum. And the other is that seizing, you suggested in relation to Phyllis Schlafly, that it wasn't anti-women's rights, but it was anti-statism that was really propelling her. And is that something that we've lost in trying to understand then what becomes the very successful political organizing against women's rights, against the ERA and other initiatives, but that may be tied to other sources?
That's a very provocative thought. Yeah, I don't know how to follow through on that, though.
There's another question.
I'm disappointed to hear Reinhold Niebuhr playing the part that he does in your paper. And some of us are used to hearing him only in the most laudatory context. But I just wanted, he assailed the idea of love. I think that was your phrase. I would hope he would have at least said, could we develop this idea a little bit? It seems almost a little unlike him. Could you just say a word more about his role?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of, what is it, Moral Man and Immoral Society, 32 or so, where he's going out on the attack, and he's doing this as straw man type of thing. So maybe by maybe you could say more about this than me, that by the time we get to the post-war years, he's softened a little bit. But in the years I encounter him, and in fact, with his encounters with YWCA women, Rose Turlin was one of his students. And worked for him in his magazine Radical Religion with the Fellowship of Socialist Christians, as did another woman who makes her appearance in the FBI files, a YWCA woman. And so that's a moment at which he is, castigating the social gospel as very, this weak response to threats that need to be answered by more radical action. And so this is kind of where he and the YWCA part company. And after the Second World War, the YWCA still looks very much like a social gospel organization, whereas Niebuhr is focusing more on this kind of neo-orthodoxy and too of the aggressive liberal anti-communism, so that he and the YWCA look very different at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a gender dimension both to Niebuhr and also to Arthur Schlesinger, as you know. The Bible Center, which is this contrast between the tough-minded, it ends up with Kennedy, but the tough-minded, masculine Christianity versus the kind of soft, dough-faced, which I think was Niebuhr's phrase. That what got us into the Popular Front and its aftermath got us into this weakened Christianity that opened the door to fascism and communism, and that what we needed was a vital center that was tough and masculine. And both Niebuhr and Schlesinger, as you know, participate in that. That might be worth thinking about.
Do you want a last word?
No.
Last question.
I don't want to leave without clarifying whether Bernie Becomes a Nun was serialized in Cosmopolitan, the Cosmopolitan magazine. So Bertie was a Cosmo girl?
Yes, and the pictures taken for that were by George Barris, who is famous as the man who took the last pictures of Marilyn Monroe. So.
Well, the only thing I would want to mention at the end is that there, in terms of additional threads to include in the narrative going forward, is the coincidence of a certain kind of popularity in the 1970s and 80s for nuns. So you remember there was, I can't remember her name, had a huge hit with Heiress 2. So, nuns were sort of cool for a particular point of time. And the Maryknoll sisters who were murdered were seen as martyrs, and they were, largely indemnified against any of the attacks made by them, by people like Jean Kirkpatrick's, because the status that they occupied was seen as protected by the kind of, by their grounding in their religion. Yeah. So there was a certain autonomy to them when attacks came against them. So there was this kind of confluence of their popularity, their unusual standing in public life. I think that might, help to pivot them to nuns on the bus who occupied the same kind of position.
Good, thank you.
I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this for a long time, because I really think that the narratives that you've offered us cause us to rethink what counts as politics, what counts in a whole lot of social movements that we thought we knew a lot about in 20th century America. So thank you so much, Amanda.